Now, the makeup of the league means that in theory, you can get the best players from NA, from EU, from Korea, from China. Likewise, you can also get the best teams and franchises from those regions. Although, yes, there are some holes in that at the moment. There's only one Chinese franchise. There's only one EU franchise. It has, by the way, no EU players on it. There's only one Korean franchise, even though, yes, there are Western franchises, NA franchises that have all Korean players. Actually, wait a second. Does that even make sense? Yes. Oh, and NYXL, what we're talking about. Now, something that I do think is great, though, about the concept of having it be a global league where they actually compete together, not just global leagues, where they're kind of separated out and region locked, as it were, is that in theory it does remove a lot of the regionally biased discussion which takes place and is often the central point in other games and the bickering. Because in theory, if you're from New York or you're from NA, you can absolutely rep NYXL. That can be your team. And you can even rep them against a squad that's actually all Westerners. There's no real reason in this game as to why you have to support them. But you look at the other games and you can see how it's very different. I mean, League of Legends, the fact that the teams don't play interregionally very often, only 2 or 3 times a year, means that you get this ridiculous amount of squabbling and what ifs and then people overreacting to a few results. In CSGO, you largely get a lot of this discussion. EU fans talking shit on NA because NA's typically been inferior. NA fans, when they get a little burst of success, tend to unfortunately overhype that success. And then they get a backlash themselves later when NA teams drop off a little bit. In Dota, it's largely, funnily enough, they don't make it NA and EU that much there because they have to kind of combine to be like West versus China, although it's really EU most of the time, but West versus China because China can put more good teams, at least in the past, than the West, unless they combined. And now, yeah, okay, it's more regionalized. With all that said, because by the way, they don't really have Koreans in that game. They do have some, but it's not like Korea is fully focused. It's never really counted in terms of region in that sense. With all that said, though, if you want to chop up the Overwatch League into players, you look at the Korean players and what a contingent they have. And I've talked about how you've only gotten more and more and more Korean players coming to the league, and it's become something of a simple shortcut to quickly shore up the positions on your team, have someone you can try out as an alternative option, fix a problem immediately, get the star player, either a key role like DPS or tank that can put you over the top immediately. So when you do chop them up, okay, yes, we have the 3 all-Korean teams. We have Dynasty, NYXL, and we have Spitfire. But okay, you know what? Fair play. Dynasty and Spitfire, while still having some of the best players in the Overwatch League, as teams have had their moments of weakness, as squads. With that said, Spitfire has still outperformed any Western squad in terms of stage titles. None of them have been won by any Western squad. But, okay, you look at NYXL, they have the players and the team, because yes, they are the clear outlier. I won't say all the Korean teams are like NYXL, they aren't. NYXL has been consistently amazing, stage after stage after stage after stage, and they have the best players on top of that. Spitfire had the first stage and has still been a good team for most of the others, but has certainly been equaled or surpassed at times by Western squads. Fusion, obviously, especially Uprising in the SAS season. So you think overall, you take NYXL as an outlier, you say, right, they're an outlier, take them out of the equation. Yeah, you know what? Generally, and at different points in time, top Western teams have had solid parity with Korean teams. But that's just Western squads, the majority of the players. You start looking at players and you see how many of those Western teams have star player, key player, sometimes leader, is actually a Korean player. So let's do this thought experiment, okay? Let's take all the teams that aren't fully Korean and we'll just take some of the key players who are Korean off those squads and think about what the impact would be. So the Boston Uprising, this team that just went 10-0 in terms of stage 3 games before the playoffs. If you take Gamsu off that team, well, we've already seen when Gamsu wasn't there, they had their issues. He's arguably been the key player on their team in terms of now that Dreamcasper's gone especially. Striker had his ups and downs, had periods where he was just decent. He's now been obviously blazing it through his last stage. Gamsu generally has been the key player in the team consistently. He's been an absolute beast. Obviously, it's been very important to have a strong tank in Overwatch League. We've certainly discovered that as each of the stages has gone on, and we've seen some of the roster moves. And obviously, if you go look at how the Seoul Dynasty's fallen apart, this team would be a shadow of themselves without him. Take Striker off. especially in a world without Dreamcast. I know people wanted to make some weird, because they wanted to put the whole Dreamcast thing so far behind them and pretend like he never mattered. They really overhyped mistakes when he came in. He played decently, yeah, he's had some good games. He wasn't Dreamcast, but he didn't have Dreamcast's versatility. And with Dreamcast disappearing, in many ways it was Striker stepping up to the fore and becoming this superstar level DPS at times that made Austin Uprising still an incredibly good team. You go to a team who hasn't done very well at all, Dallas Fuel, and you might think, come on, it's not that big a deal to take a player off their team, right? Effect has consistently been the best player on that team, and you could make a strong case. The only truly bright spot on that team, through all the darkness and all the problems, even at their worst, this guy still turned up, still fragged, still did a really good performance, even though, yes, he had his own issues outside of the game. Inside the game, this guy's always been money, so God only knows where they would be without Effect. You put in another player who's a Western player onto that team and isn't already locked up elsewhere, where the hell would they be? They'd have probably lost to Shanghai Dragons by now. They'd have lost a few more games to the Florida Mayhem. They might be second worst team in the Overwatch League. Obviously nowhere near Shanghai Dragons, but they would be in a much worse position overall, whereas they've at least been able to vie with Florida Mayhem. Never really gotten close to getting out of hell, but that would be a big, big deal. You look at the Florida Mayhem who I just spoke about, they were the second worst team for a long time. Dallas could be shit, but hey, at least we're not the Florida Mayhem and Shanghai Dragons, right? Why is Florida Mayhem now putting themselves in a position to go ahead of Dallas Fuel, actually looking like a team where, sure, they don't win a lot of games, but they look very competitive in some of them, or there's times where they have amazing moments in them. It's all because of one guy who arrived. They started with the old Nordic squad, not until a guy called Sire Player arrived. Remember him? Meta Athena? What a fucking beast, right? This guy comes in, he's been fragging like a monster. Still doesn't win the games, sadly, because the team's not good enough, but this guy has at least given them that injection, given them that star-level player that actually the whole team just lacked entirely in this league, despite the history and prestige of some of the great players like Tavik that they have on their squad. You go to Philadelphia Fusion. Okay, I'll say, even though they've got a lot of Koreans, I'm not, by the way, picking every Korean, I'm picking the focal ones here. I'll say on this for Philadelphia Fusion, because they have a good mix, and especially some good EU players, and obviously someone like EQO, they don't need the Koreans as much as some of these other squads, but you take Carpe off that team and they will be a team in trouble. Because what was it like before EQO got there? Well, everyone talked about how the synergy between Shadowburn and Carpe was so amazing. This is all pre-Snillo as well. Oh, that's really what it was. Well, Shadowburn's long gone and Carpe doesn't seem to be lacking for some lack of synergy. I mean, poorly phrased there, but it's just a video. Doesn't seem to be lacking for not having Shadowburn around, still being really good without him, right? Still being a key focal point as to why Fusion's been one of the best teams. Some people said best Western team for stage 3, stage 2 rather. Then you take Fisher off LA Gladiators. This would be one of the most crippling. Gamsu off Uprising is definitely up there, but if you take Fisher off Gladiators, well, for a start off, we already saw what Gladiators like before Fisher. They were a middling team, actually at times towards the end of their period before Fisher came over. They looked like they were starting to slide down into the bottom pack, actually, closer to the Dallas Fuels of this world than the teams at the time who were the best squads in the Overwatch League. Then Fisher came in. Immediately, they became arguably the best Western team. They became one of the very best teams in the league. They were getting all these amazing wins, both on his individual play and his leadership factors. Sure, they've leveled off a bit since then, but they're still a dangerous squad. If anything, you've seen players like Shore4 coming online. We've seen the impact that a tank can have on the team, and obviously a tank who knows how to lead and has ridiculous balls in terms of Fisher. So it really seems like a man's man, like leads by example. Then you look at a team like LA Valiant. Sure, they have mixed it up. They've had Koreans, but in the last stage, Bonnie has been a key component for them. He's really turned things around from where he was at before. You look at Kareev, obviously mainly when he's in the support role. What a great guy this guy has been for this team. One of the key components. No wonder their coach, when he came in, was willing to give him a chance up there. These squads have all been very reliant to pretty reliant on these top Korean players. Basically, only the Houston Outlaws, who technically do have Arhon, but he hasn't made any real impact on the team. Only the Houston Outlaws would be, or would have been, vaguely as good without Korean players on their teams. Now, I'm obviously not saying you take those players off and they just have to use their subs for these teams and you don't have any players. No, I'm imagining they would get other Western talent that's available or bid for other players from other teams. So aside from, unless you take all the Outlaws players and use them to plug up all the other spots on the other teams and put Linkser on this squad and put Muma onto this other team, like Gladiators or something. Sure, you could do that maybe and make those teams pretty good. I'd argue they still wouldn't be as good, quite frankly, though. You have to look at it. And the whole point I'm making is I'm implying you can't just replace these top players with Western talent generally and expect that you could get anywhere near the same results. Now, sure, I understand a lot of the backlash and the sort of, I wouldn't say anti-Korean sentiment. I'd just say people being overly optimistic, imagining that it wouldn't matter about Korean players and that, you can have all the Western players and they'll be just as good. Sure, we had teams coming into the Overwatch League beforehand, Rogue, a long time ago, Envious. Yes, we had teams like Seoul Dynasty who've just underwhelmed the whole way through the Overwatch League when they had these legendary players in terms of their supportive core, and then they brought in some strong DPS players, particularly obviously Fletter, who is fucking amazing. And yeah, on paper, it was tempting to call them, these guys should win the Overwatch League, they should never be able to lose to Westerns, they should be one of the elite teams. Sure, maybe people overhyped them in that sense and they haven't delivered on it. But I think too much has been made of how close the gap is between Western players and Western teams and the Korean teams. For me, it's similar, although maybe a little bit more positive in Overwatch, to many of the other games like League of Legends and StarCraft, where, okay, yes, the top elite Westerners, like if you pick out the 1 or 2 top at their role, or the top 5 or 10 Western players, yes, they can compete with, and in certain cases, be either as good or occasionally better than the top elite Koreans. Even then, I'd say I'd give the nod to the top elite Koreans, but the top elite Koreans play in Korean teams, so maybe they get a boost from that factor. Sure, I'll take that into consideration. The problem is, once you get past the top 10 Western players, or you get past the top few Korean players, and you look like, oh, what's the 13th to 20th best Korean player like versus the 13th to best Western player? I'd say the gap opens wide up, actually. You've seen why some of these players who aren't on those Korean teams are really amazing and really pivotal players on the Western teams, and that's in scenarios where some of them don't even have good communications, can't speak very advanced levels of English, and in some senses actually have their games limited in that sense, which is something I'd like you to think about now with another thought experiment. Since those players might actually be limited, and maybe their synergy with some of the Western players might not always be the best, and maybe they would be better players or look like even bigger stars, or maybe the best players if they played on all Korean teams. What if you took all those Korean names off the Western teams and you made 1 or 2 more all Korean teams? What if you had a squad that had Fisher leading it as a tank, and it had DPS players like Striker or Sire player, and it had support player like Kareev, and it had, well, if you don't want Fisher, how about Gamsu? Or what about OGE? There's so many different ways you can go there. You could imagine making 1 or 2 really competitive squads out of this. I'm talking squads that could win the Overwatch League, or the very least be elite tier top 2 to 3 teams. Definitely a playoff team by the end of the Overwatch League if they played the whole 4 stages. I don't mean definitely in terms of it would definitely happen, but like that's definitely the capability and the trajectory they could be on. We've got to appreciate these Koreans. And that's one of the points of this video. Not to say, the West shit, haha, Koreans are the best. No, I'm saying let's appreciate the Koreans and the impact that they've had, because they're playing for Western teams now. So you're getting a cheer for them and they can be the team that you want as well. And actually, by the way, I'm not saying teams should recruit Western players. I think that would be a silly idea. Recruiting top or talented Korean players, especially ones who can fill a key role in your squad, is an absolutely valid strategy for making a better team. We've not only seen it happen in games like League of Legends, Overwatch, League of Legends. I mean, League of Legends in terms of Europe and NA, in terms of making better squads. But there's also the factor that it's just a better strategy than hoping some talent who's yet to prove himself from the West makes it. Because obviously a lot of the proven talent from the West is already in the Overwatch League. So you'd be relying on youngsters that haven't yet proven themselves at the elite level to come in and to be better than this Korean player. I mean, as someone who comes from the UK, and obviously the Premier League, when I grew up and I was a boy, the Premier League, actually just started in the 90s, I think, when I was a kid, was pretty good, but you know what? It wasn't as good as the Italian league. And then years later, it wasn't good as the Spanish league. And in fact, in European championships, it hasn't done very well for the last 20 years, quite frankly. But one of the reasons why the English Premier League is arguably the best league in the world right now for the last 10 years, and it's certainly one of the most viewed, one of the most exciting, is because they allowed an influx of foreign talent. It no longer became about just getting UK players, but getting whatever the best player you was, and with the money that you've got, and if that's a viable strategy to having one of the best teams, then so be it. So yes, I do think there is a dark element here though, which is that one concern I have, and it's something I talked about in that Korean creep video, is my possible concern that it becomes too clear a shortcut, which I do think has been the case. I mean, you look at Fisher at LA Gladiators, it turned them around overnight. You look at Gamsu's role on Uprising, and listen, they might have still been a very good team. Dreamcast was a revelation. What would that team have been like, though, without Gamsun as striker? I don't think they'd have been anywhere near as good, and I think they would have been more in line with what people originally thought. Like, oh, okay, some names here that maybe have some potential, but you need a lot of ifs to come true before this team's going to be anything good. Nowhere near a team that could win a stage undefeated. Even in the very short term, where this guy hasn't had a lot of time to impact this team, but you look at Architect coming in on shock. First of all, he could have made some of these other Western teams, I actually think, one of the best teams in the league, so I think they missed out on the Architect lottery. But also, you look at the impact he's already having on shock, and I think he's already proven that this is a team that now has a good talent base, but he's already proven talent. Some of the others, yeah, you're still not quite sure what Sonata is going to be like versus his potential back at the Overwatch World Cup, right? You've still got to wait for some of the others to fully develop, or maybe they're just very good on one or two heroes right now. Architect's already looking pretty sick, and he might end up being that missing quality they needed to move up into that top 4, top 5 type consistent quality in terms of Overwatch League teams. Then you look at coaches, even beyond players. I made this stat on Oversight last week, 2 weeks ago I think it was, where something like 10 of the 12 teams in the Overwatch League have a Korean coach in some capacity. A number of them head coaches. I mean, obviously we've got people like Tyrong, who's been very key over on Outlaws. Then you've got Krusty. A lot of people acknowledging actually that maybe he was one of the key reasons why Uprising was so special. Obviously now he's moved. Then you've got a player like a coach like Moon on the Valiant. Even Mayhem had to take on a Korean coach at some point in time because Mineral was having his issues. So again, this isn't about bashing Western players. It's about pointing out what I think is a reasonable distribution of Koreans that has been a big reason why these Western squads have been able to compete. With that said, extra shout out to the Houston Outlaws for what they've been able to accomplish at their own periods of time, even though everyone does say they're a patch team. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing. But I've graduated from that mindset, and now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.